Battle of Stalingrad was not only the bloodiest conflict of the entire Second World War, but it also marked a turning point in the war itself. In its expansion campaign, Germany did not advance beyond this city. Following their defeat here, the Nazis were forced into retreat. All the territory they had conquered was lost, and their downfall would not stop until their surrender in Berlin. For Hitler, the blame for his defeat in this pivotal battle did not lie with the Soviet enemy or the harsh Russian winter, but with one of his own men, a general who committed one of the worst possible crimes in the Third Reich, disobeying the Führer. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you all about Friedrich Paulus, the man who betrayed Hitler. Friedrich Paulus was born on September 23, 1890, in the Kingdom of Prussia, then part of the German Empire. He belonged to a middle-class family, so von Paulus, as you might have heard him referred to, is incorrect, as that prefix is only used in aristocratic families. From an early age, he wanted to join the German armed forces, enlisting as an officer cadet in 1910. With the onset of the First World War, he saw combat in Romania, Serbia, and France, including the famous Battle of Verdun, one of the bloodiest of the conflict. Thanks to his performance, by the end of the war, Paulus had achieved the rank of captain. After Germany's surrender, the victorious countries forced it to sign the Treaty of Versailles. This imposed terribly unfavorable conditions on the German Empire, such as territorial concessions, economic reparations, and military restrictions. One of these was the reduction of its national army to only 100,000 men. Of these, only 4,000 were allowed to be officers. Paulus was one of them. He also was part of the Freikorps, paramilitary militias formed mainly by veterans of the Great War. During the German Revolution of 1918 and 1919, this unit, where Paulus served as a brigade aide, acted brutally against the communists seeking to overthrow the government. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power and quickly began to challenge the Treaty of Versailles. One of his first military measures was the modernization of the country's war machinery. Paulus, who was still part of the army, was put in charge of a motorized battalion between 1934 and 1935. At the end of the latter year, a new command was created with the role of directing the training and development of armored forces, or Panzerwaffe. These troops were crucial in the Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, that Hitler planned to carry out in just a few years for his intended conquest of Europe. Let's listen to an explanation of what this new strategy entailed.
Blitzkrieg was based on surprise attack. Two main elements were involved. The weapon on the ground was the Panzer Division of high-speed tanks, and they attacked in liaison with a dive bomber from the air. The most famous of these was the terrifying Stuka Ju-87 dive bomber. The Stuka's part was to pound away at the enemy on the ground, carving a path for the tanks to thrust in and divide the enemy troops. Those troops, once isolated, could then be quickly mopped up by the German infantry following the tanks.
Paulus was appointed Chief of Staff of the Panzerwaffe. He continued there as German forces continued to consolidate. In clear opposition to the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler increased the number of troops from the 100,000 allowed to nearly 3 million. Additionally, he created the U-boat division, ordered the construction of heavy artillery, and organized the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. The Führer exploited his people's resentment towards the treaty to expand his power. His goal was the annexation of European territory to obtain the living space that Nazism deemed necessary for the survival of the Aryan race. He had already annexed Austria and Czechoslovakia, despite weak protests from the United Kingdom and its allies. Everyone could see that a new conflict was looming, but unfortunately, little was done to control the dictator's advance. A few months before the start of the Second World War, Paulus was promoted to Major General and became part of the 10th Army, under the command of Heinz Guderian. Guderian praised Paulus's intelligence, will, and talent, but he had doubts about his determination, toughness, and lack of experience. Would he be able to make difficult decisions that put the lives of his men at risk? Guderian wouldn't have to wait long to find out. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, marking the beginning of the Second World War. Their new blitzkrieg tactics swept aside the Polish defenses and their outdated strategies. Just 1 month later, they had surrendered to the powerful Nazi machinery. Paulus participated in this campaign and dispelled his superiors' doubts, standing out in his leadership. After the Polish capitulation, the 10th Army was renamed the 6th, a designation it would retain until its end. As Hitler's expansion campaign continued, Paulus and his troops achieved more military successes. On May 10, 1940, the massive invasion of Western Europe by Germany began. Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and France were attacked by German troops. They resisted for only 6 weeks. Paulus and his 6th Army participated in numerous battles throughout this campaign, playing a vital role in the fall of Belgium and the destruction of Paris's defenses. After the surrender of these territories, Paulus was promoted to lieutenant general. A month later, he was appointed deputy chief of the General Staff of Germany. In this role, he was vital in devising how to carry out one of his Führer's greatest dreams. It was known by all that, for Hitler, communists were an enemy that had to be destroyed. For the Nazi leader, this political doctrine and Judaism were vitally intertwined. Moreover, Slavs were, according to him, subhuman. All of this made the Soviet Union a fundamental military target for his plans. Germany could not exist in peace with the Bolsheviks as neighbors. He had even openly discussed his idea of conquering territory belonging to this country. This caused relations between the two countries to deteriorate sharply since Hitler's rise to power. However, the alliance between Great Britain and Poland in early 1939 made the Führer consider a treaty with the Russians. He saw that the British would likely intervene in his conquest plans, so it was in his interest to know that he would have peace on his Eastern Front. Just weeks before his attack on Poland, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between the two countries. They also divided Eastern European countries with Stalin, even splitting Poland in two with a joint occupation. In this way, they ensured that there would be no conflict of interests. While Hitler advanced with his conquest of Europe, the Soviet Union fought its own battles far from the Germans, but both leaders knew that this was only temporary. With the help of Paulus and other generals, Hitler began to devise Operation Barbarossa, as the invasion of the Soviet Union was known. The general supported the idea of using the already proven blitzkrieg to quickly advance into Russian territory. Thus, he sought to defeat them quickly and prevent them from fleeing to the vast steppes. If this was not achieved, they faced a long and arduous war that would quickly deplete German resources, as asserted by a historian in the following video.
Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union was his greatest gamble of the Second World War. They needed a swift victory to destroy the Soviet Union in the summer. If it was a campaign that was drawn into the winter, they weren't prepared for that psychologically, technically, or in terms of their fighting methods.
The Nazi offensive would be divided into 3 army groups, each with its particular mission. Paulus's 6th Army was within Group South. Its main objective was the conquest of Ukraine, whose fertile fields would alleviate the Reich's agricultural needs. They also sought to seize the oil reserves of the Caucasus, vital for the use of their armored vehicles. Depriving this from the Soviet Union would leave them practically no chance of victory. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941. The onset of the attack saw significant victories for Germany. The Soviets were swept aside by German infantry and armored units. By the end of 1941, they had conceded a vast expanse of territory. But with the onset of autumn rains turning the terrain into muddy ground, the advance lost momentum. By September 1941, 2 of the Army Corps had ceased their advance in Russia and were engaged in besieging Leningrad and Moscow. Only the forces Paulus was part of continued to advance, although successful Soviet counterattacks slowed their conquests. In mid-1942, Germany launched Operation Blue, an offensive aimed at decisively eliminating the military might of the Red Army. In addition to the conquest of the Caucasus, a key part of the success of this plan was the capture of Stalingrad. This task fell to none other than Paulus. In August of that year, the Sixth Army reached the outskirts of the city. There began a terrible bombardment by planes and artillery that destroyed much of the buildings. Many of the explosives used by the Germans were incendiary, and the city was engulfed in flames. Despite this, Stalin had refused to evacuate the citizens, as he needed the city's factories to continue producing goods. In the first 48 hours, tens of thousands of civilians died in the flames. However, despite the daily German attacks and their air and artillery superiority, Soviet troops resisted. Over the next 3 months, Nazis and Russians fought inside the city in an unprecedented urban war. The confrontation was, as many said, house by house. The Germans even bitterly called it Rattenkrieg or Rat War, saying that one could capture the kitchen but still had to fight for the living room. The idea of blitzkrieg was long gone. The conditions in which both armies battled in Stalingrad were atrocious. Soldiers fell victim to numerous diseases, and rats and other pests consumed their already scarce provisions. But the worst enemy was the weather. The harsh Russian winter, the same one that had ended Napoleon's invasion 130 years earlier, was making itself felt. Men suffered frostbite in extremities or parts of their faces, which in many cases became gangrenous and had to be amputated. Thousands of soldiers, mostly Germans, died of hypothermia. In 3 months, Paulus's Sixth Army had lost around 60,000 men, but everything was about to get worse. In November 1942, the Soviet Union launched a massive counteroffensive called Operation Uranus, with the aim of eliminating the German forces. Paulus failed to prevent the Russians to the north of his position from linking up with those to the south. This resulted in his forces, numbering over 200,000 men, being completely surrounded. Let's now take a look at some scenes from this terrible battle.
The Russian ring closes round the 6th German Army at Stalingrad. The great liberation offensive bears down on 22 trapped Nazi divisions, representing 330,000 doomed men. The end of 163 days of siege. The history of warfare has never known such an encirclement and annihilation of so large a number of regular troops. Hundreds of thousands of bodies lie frozen in and around the city. Almost as many died of the appalling conditions of the last few weeks. They rot in the land which they wanted to enslave.
Faced with this situation, Hitler ordered Paulus to resist no matter what. Despite the brutal conditions, the general obeyed. As long as they kept fighting in Stalingrad, the Soviets couldn't move troops to other fronts. Paulus declared, "We must hold them here until the end so that the Eastern Front can stabilize. Only if that happens is there a chance for the war to go well for Germany." This didn't happen. The other German Army Corps continued to fiercely battle their enemy without achieving decisive victories. Even an operation aimed at breaking the Russian encirclement around the Sixth Army, named Winter Storm, failed. Paulus's men remained isolated. For 2 months, they continued to resist fiercely, but shortages of food, medicine, and ammunition were becoming critical. This was compounded by the winter, which was at its peak, reaching temperatures as low as -40 degrees Celsius. At the beginning of 1943, in recognition of their bravery, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Colonel General. However, the promotion did not come with any of the promised assistance. On January 7th, General Rokossovsky, leading the Soviet offensives, called for a ceasefire. Taking advantage of the temporary cessation of hostilities, he offered surprisingly generous surrender terms to Paulus. His men would have access to normal rations, medical treatment, and could keep their belongings. By this time, Paulus knew there was no chance that the Sixth Army could hold out much longer. He wrote to Hitler asking for permission to surrender. Of course, this was flatly denied. A fierce Soviet attack began immediately. The Germans lost ground and men at an alarming rate, every soldier had to ensure their own food and ammunition. The wounded were left without treatment and were consumed by the cold. At the end of January, the Russians offered Paulus another chance to surrender. He communicated this again to Hitler, expressing the impossibility of his situation. Stalingrad was hours away from falling. Despite this, the Führer ordered him to defend the city to the death and promoted him to field marshal. But this gift was poisoned. The Nazi leader told him that there had never been, in the history of Germany, a field marshal who had surrendered to the enemy. This implied that if he were captured alive, it would be a shame for the military history of the country. Here you can hear what Paulus thought at that moment.
Paulus ha sido nombrado mariscal por el propio Hitler 24 horas antes para alentarle a de forma honorable. Pero el general declara: no voy a matarme por ese cabo. Para él, Hitler ya no es el Führer, sino un simple soldado de la Primera Guerra Mundial cuya incompetencia les ha conducido al desastre. Cuando comparece ante los soviéticos, Paulus solo siente odio por Hitler.
The German Sixth Army surrendered on January 31st, 1943. Thus, this corps, which had been considered one of the best in the Nazi armed forces, ceased to exist. At the end of the fighting, the Nazi soldiers who could still stand were malnourished, emaciated, wrapped in towels to retain some warmth. They contrasted with the Russians in their winter uniforms and well-fed appearance. Just over 91,000 men belonging to the Sixth Army were captured. In total, the Battle of Stalingrad cost the lives of over 700,000 Germans and 1 million Soviets, including civilian casualties. When Hitler learned of the marshal's surrender, he flew into a rage. He could not understand how a man who had bravely seen so many of his soldiers die chose to surrender to the Bolsheviks rather than end his own life. Prior to his capitulation, Paulus had sent his wedding ring to his wife. He hadn't seen her since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa in 1942, and he would never see her again. After Paulus's surrender, on Hitler's orders, his wife was sent by the Germans to the Dachau concentration camp, while one of his sons was imprisoned. Paulus's already low opinion of his leader sank even deeper. Despite this, initially, Paulus refused to collaborate with the Soviets. But on July 20, 1944, a failed assassination attempt on Hitler's life occurred, resulting in the execution of its perpetrators. Several of these had been close friends of Paulus. In addition to the resentment he already felt towards the dictator, this event made him change his mind. He became a staunch critic of the Nazi regime. During his captivity in Russian hands, he joined the National Committee for a United Germany, backed by the Soviet Union, which urged Germans to surrender. Although this would only happen on May 8, 1945, with Hitler already dead. After the Second World War ended, Paulus, unlike other military personnel, participated in the Nuremberg trials not as a defendant, but as a witness. There, he spoke about how the plans for the invasion of Soviet territory were conceived and carried out. During the trial, a journalist asked him about the German prisoners of war captured in Stalingrad. Paulus confirmed that they were well and that their mothers and wives could sleep peacefully. But this was a lie. Of the 91,000 Germans captured after the surrender, only 5,000 would return to Germany. Whether due to combat injuries, diseases, cold, or the terrible conditions of the labor camps where they were sent, more than 85,000 men would never see their families again. Thanks to Paulus's testimony, it was confirmed that the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union and the crimes committed there had been planned years in advance. Below, you can listen to the military speaking at the Nuremberg trials.
Von den Angeklagten, soweit sie in meinem Blickfeld lagen, die ersten militärischen Berater Hitlers. Das ist der Chef des Oberkommandos der Wehrmacht Keitel, der Chef des Wehrmachtsführungsamtes Jodl und Göring in seiner Eigenschaft als Reichsmarschall, als Oberbefehlshaber der Luftwaffe und als Bevollmächtigter den rüstungswirtschaftlichen Gebieten.
In 1953, Paulus was released and allowed to settle in the newly established German Democratic Republic. But although he was back in his homeland, nothing would ever be the same again. His wife had died in 1949, and one of his sons died in combat in 1944. Only 2 of his descendants survived. He spent his final years as the head of the Military History Research Institute of East Germany. Although it might seem like he was living a normal life, the Soviets still had him in their sights. Without his knowledge, some of his employees were members of the Stasi, the country's secret police, and his phone was tapped. In 1957, at the age of 66, Friedrich Paulus died after a brief battle with sclerosis. One day earlier, it had been 14 years since the end of the Battle of Stalingrad. He was the highest-ranking German officer to surrender during World War II, and one of the first to defy Hitler. For the Führer and many of his fellow officers, he was a coward and a traitor. For others, because he refused to sacrifice more of his men in vain and collaborated with the Soviets after his surrender, his figure is that of a tragic hero. Whatever the stance, it cannot be denied that Paulus was one of the most important military figures of this war. We've reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, what do you think of Friedrich Paulus's actions? Did he betray the Führer, or did he do the right thing? Leave us your answer in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.